It was midnight on July 30th, 1973, on a raft in the middle of the Caribbean. While 4 people slept, 7 others quietly gathered to plot mutiny and murder. The night was warm, the seas calm. The same could not be said for people's thoughts and emotions. Nearly 3 months ago, 11 crew members had embarked aboard the Acali, a vessel that the international press had salaciously dubbed the sex raft. These 11 people were part of a social experiment set up by the crackpot social anthropologist Santiago Genoves. But the experiment had gone horribly, horribly wrong. Tempers had flared. Deep abiding hatreds had been born. The crew were crossing the Atlantic Ocean on a raft just 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, or 39 by 22 feet, built with plywood, rivets, and a few iron beams. It was risky, and one good storm could kill them all. One storm nearly did. In the middle of the raft was a cabin, where 4 people now slept. The vessel's nurse, Edna Reeves, a Catholic priest, Bernardo Bongo, a trained sea captain, Maria Bjornstam, who had recently been stripped of command of the vessel, and the man who had usurped her, the architect of the twisted social experiment, a tyrant, a deluded megalomaniac, and an incompetent fool, Santiago Genoves. For the past several weeks, Genoves had been the crew's tormentor, and he had nearly gotten all of them killed. 3 weeks remained before the Acali arrived in Mexico. In the meantime, Genoves represented a clear and present danger to them all. And that is why he had to die. On the roof of the cabin, the 7 conspirators gathered, speaking in hushed tones just above Genoves's head while they plotted his death. The mutineers were Mary Gidley, the Acali's navigator, Faye Seymour, the vessel's radio operator, Sylvain Zanotti, a professional scuba diver, Charles Anthony, a deckhand and dog's body, Jose Maria Montero Perez, a former student of Genoves, who had also submitted to being a lowly deckhand, Isuke Yamaki, the photographer and videographer of the Acali's voyage, and Rashida Leave, a beautiful, charismatic, and intelligent environmentalist from Paris. The conspirators met with every intention of snuffing out a life and dumping the corpse into the sea, where the sharks and bottom feeders of the deep could attend to what was left of him. The question was, how to carry out the murder? Suffice to say, nobody had any experience on that score. Isuke Yamaki proposed that he convince Santiago Genoves to pose for a photograph near the edge of the raft. The crackpot anthropologist could be pushed overboard while the vessel sailed swiftly onward, the mutinous crew ignoring his cries for help. That way, no blood or other forensic evidence would be found aboard the Acali, and, after arriving in Mexico, the crew could claim it was an accidental death. Yet, if Yamaki failed to knock Genoves overboard, the murder could quickly become quite messy. Genoves might fight back, potentially harming one of the mutineers, perhaps inflicting injuries that would have to be explained to Mexican authorities. Or perhaps, as he struggled, Genoves would bleed out all over the deck, leaving bloodstains that couldn't be fully scrubbed out before he was finally killed and tossed into the sea. As an alternative, Faye Seymour, the radio operator, wanted to raid the vessel's medical supplies and give Genoves an overdose of painkillers in his food. Then the mutineers could simply toss his unconscious body over the guardrail to quickly drown in the Caribbean. Yet there was a vague chance that, after arriving in Mexico, authorities might question why so many painkillers were consumed on the voyage. But drugging seemed like a more sensible plan than simply trying to knock Genoves off the raft. There was also the difficulty of swearing the 10 crew members of the Acali into total and perpetual secrecy about the murder. The 7 people atop the roof of the cabin that night were convinced, more or less, that Genovese needed to die, but also sleeping down below were the Acali's former captain, the vessel's nurse, and, most dubious of all, a Catholic priest who would need to be convinced of the necessity and the virtues of premeditated murder. Otherwise, they would likely be witnesses to the killing and inform the Mexican police when the Acali arrived at its destination. Even if they said they were okay with it in the moment, either genuinely or under duress, they might reverse their position and tell the authorities once the Acali made landfall. And Mexican prison in the 1970s was not a nice place to be. Faye Seymour suggested a solution to this. After drugging Genovese, each crew member could take turns stabbing him with a knife, so that everyone would be implicated in the murder, just like the mob of senators stabbing Julius Caesar to death on the Ides of March. It was fitting, after all, since Genovese was just as much a tyrant in their eyes. If everybody aboard plunged a knife into Genovese before his body was tossed into the sea, they would all be tainted with the crime, dissuading anyone from confessing what had happened once they came ashore in Mexico. Such was the hatred for Santiago Genovese that burned in the hearts of the crew that many of them were willing to wield the blade. All while Genovese, the tyrant, the tormentor, the megalomaniac, the fool, slumbered a few feet below them, completely oblivious to the danger. Meet Santiago Genovese. Santiago Genovese was born in Orense, Galicia, Spain, on New Year's Eve, 1923. After the outbreak of the bloody Spanish Civil War in 1936, Genovese and his family fled to Mexico. According to him, it was the Civil War that sparked his intense obsession with violence. Genovese devoted his entire life to figuring out what in the human character prompted such dark impulses, in order to socially engineer humanity toward a path of peace and tranquility. With this in mind, Genovese studied anthropology and eventually landed a faculty position at the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. Most of his ideas were ludicrous, ill-informed hogwash. His experiments were sometimes dangerous and unethical. As a person, many of his colleagues found Genovese to be pompous and unpleasant. The sex raft also had a precursor. In 1969, Genovese teamed up with Norwegian ethnographer Thor Heyerdahl, whose theory was that ancient African cultures were more advanced than they were usually given the credit for. Heyerdahl claimed that Africa could have colonized the Americas long before Europeans did. To test the theory, Heyerdahl, Genovese, and an international team of other scholars built a small boat made of papyrus reeds based on an ancient Egyptian design and attempted to sail it across the Atlantic, from Morocco to the Americas. The boat actually made it about 4,000 miles before the stern of the craft sagged, crumbled, and fell off, leaving Heyerdahl and his team stranded in the western Atlantic, not far from the Caribbean. They were eventually saved from death by a passing holiday yacht. Heyerdahl would later claim that they had neglected an aspect of ancient Egyptian design that would have prevented the stern of the boat from disintegrating. But that simply wasn't true. The reality was that papyrus boats were meant for trade along the Nile River or sailing the more placid waters of the Mediterranean, not being buffeted about by the huge waves and frequent storms of the Atlantic. Although the project was an utter failure, it gave Santiago Genovese the seed of an idea for a raft experiment that would explore the nature of human violence. That is because, while aboard the papyrus boat, Genovese had fought bitterly with Heyerdahl and his team, with the fights allegedly turning violent and borderline homicidal on several occasions. Genovese hypothesized that when people were isolated from civilization, their social manners would break down, and they would quickly become violent savages. At the time, it did not seem to occur to Genovese that the reason why tempers flared aboard the papyrus boat was not because the core nature of people was savagery, but because Genovese himself was a pompous jackass with a talent for alienating others. In hindsight, it is pretty clear that Genovese was the common denominator in both Atlantic voyages where people wanted to murder him. His desire to embark on a violence project gained further momentum when Genovese was taken hostage during the Southern Airways Flight 49 hijacking on November 10, 1972. The plane was meant to fly from Birmingham, Alabama to Orlando, Florida, but 3 fugitives from justice smuggled guns and grenades aboard and redirected the flight to Tennessee. This was an age before proper security screening at airports, and the hijacking itself directly led to the US government introducing, for the very first time, metal detectors and pat-downs before passengers got anywhere near a plane. The Flight 49 hijackers demanded $10 million over the radio, or $75 million in modern money, or else they'd fly the plane into a nuclear reactor at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, causing a meltdown that could have killed thousands of people. The hostage takers were negotiated down to $2 million, or roughly $15 million in modern money, and they landed at Lovell Field, Chattanooga, where they picked up the money without authorities trying to apprehend them. Then the plane took off again for Cuba. But Fidel Castro rejected the hijackers' appeal for asylum, and they were forced to fly to Florida. After the plane landed at an Orlando airfield, the FBI opened fire on the craft and shot out 2 of the plane's tires. In the chaos, the hijackers threatened the airline pilot and shot him in the arm before coercing the co-pilot at gunpoint to take off again. They had nowhere to go, except to return to Cuba, where the hijackers were promptly arrested and Castro freed the hostages and sent them home. Far from being distressed by this 30-hour ordeal, Santiago Genovese claims that he was like a kid in a candy store. The social anthropologist had enjoyed a first-hand opportunity to observe human violence in an enclosed space, rather than just in theory, or a sterile laboratory setting, or a campus test group made up of horny and hungover 20-year-olds. And so, after returning to Mexico, Genovese procured a research grant and rapidly set his violence project into motion. Cheerleader for murder and rape. Genovese's raft experiment was thoroughly unethical and ill-conceived. He was inspired by tests run on laboratory chimpanzees in America, where a number of male and female chimps were locked in a cage together. The male chimps fought violently with each other over sexual access to the females, who were, in turn, brutalized. Genovese hypothesized that if you locked up human beings in an enclosed space for a long duration as well, they would essentially do the same thing. And, most unethically of all, in order to be proven right, he wanted the violence and rape to happen. Genovese predicted that if you put a bunch of good-looking males and females on a raft in the Atlantic and stoked their jealousies and animosities, there would be a slew of attempted murders and unwanted pregnancies by the end of the voyage. Genovese seemingly overlooked the fact that chimps aren't humans, and we are separated by about 6 to 8 million years of evolution, where a lot of important cognitive and behavioral changes took place. Human males are, in general, much less aggressive than male chimps, and humans of both sexes are obviously much more capable of peaceful reasoning and cooperation. Having a larger prefrontal cortex and the power of speech certainly f***ing helps in that regard. But Genovese treated humans and chimps as 1-to-1 in his predictions for the voyage. He apparently also wasn't clued in by the fact that, unlike chimps, humans are reluctant to pelt each other with their own feces. Nevertheless, The central idea was to build a small raft without a motor and cross the Atlantic from Africa to Mexico. Then Genovese would literally sit back and take notes while his test subjects attempted to rape and murder each other. He would not intervene. Genovese put out advertisements in newspapers worldwide asking for volunteers. He said nothing specific about his intentions or his predictions for the experiment. All Genovese said was that he wanted to study human behavior and cooperation to help establish, quote, world peace. This may sound lame and naive to modern ears, but bear in mind this was 1973. Establishing world peace was not yet a tawdry old cliché uttered only by the more brain-dead contestants of American beauty pageants. Such vague, kumbaya, hippy-dippy bullshit still held a lot of sway amongst the boomer generation. As a result, hundreds of idealistic young people applied. Genovese had his pick of the litter. He selected people from different countries, political perspectives, and religious beliefs, saying he wanted to create a microcosm of the world. In reality, he just wanted to see if these differences would facilitate conflict. But he doubted it, postulating that the violence would be caused by more primal impulses than culture. Primal impulses like sex. Genovese selected 6 women and 4 men as his test subjects, and, in his own words, I made sure that they were all physically attractive, increasing the odds that they'd want to have sex with each other. In this sense, Genovese might have missed a trick, since if you had people of varying degrees of attractiveness, this might focus competition on the desirable few, and the resulting sexual rejection and jealousy of the others might be more likely to promote conflict. On the other hand, if everybody's hot, everybody has options, and roughly equal ability to shoot their shot. Genovese also made sure that 3 of the 6 women selected for the journey already had children. His reason for this was another misreading of 6 to 8 million years of evolution. Chimpanzee males find females who've already had offspring as the most desirable, because it proves they can have babies. That way, a male chimp knows that potentially violent competition over a female is worth his time and the risk. But, again, chimps and humans are different. Chimps are a promiscuous species. Males try to fuck pretty much any female they can. There is no monogamy whatsoever. Whereas, in the past 2 million years, humans have evolved more monogamous pair bonding instincts, albeit imperfect ones. Men are more likely to try to have children with one person, rather than impregnate everything that moves. Only a small minority of men are the proverbial boys, and even they tend to fall into monogamous relationships at some point in their lives. A human male's investment in his children is also a lot higher compared to a chimpanzee. So the fact that a woman has had children before matters less to human men than making sure the kids that she does have are actually his. So the entire act of Genovese bringing in 3 women who had already had children was entirely pointless. Another gender dynamic Genovese hoped to mine for conflict was the cultural expectation that men take on leadership positions. Genovese wasn't sure if this was natural or cultural, or both. But again, looking at chimpanzees, Genovese saw that they were an extremely male-led, male-dominant species, where females were fairly isolated and didn't form firm alliances with each other. As such, Genovese hoped to stoke conflict by giving the 6 women more important positions on the raft, while giving the 4 men menial tasks. Genovese predicted that the men would come to resent female authority and work to undermine and overthrow them. All applicants had to submit to a full physical and psychological exam. They were asked very intrusive questions about their sex lives, relationship history, political points of view, and their attitudes toward violence, self-defense, sexual assault, and past thoughts of committing homicide. The candidates who were eventually selected for the voyage were Sylvain Zanotti, a 32-year-old French woman, married with children, who was a professional scuba diver. Edna Reeves, a 32-year-old Israeli woman, single, who was a medical doctor. Rashida Leave, a 23-year-old Algerian woman living in Paris, single, who worked as an environmentalist. Genovez deemed her the most sexually attractive of the women on board. Mary Gidley, a 36-year-old white American woman who had children and was in the process of divorcing a physically abusive husband. She was a waitress who was experienced in maritime navigation. Faye Seymour, a 23-year-old African-American woman, married with children, who had experience operating a ham radio. Charles Anthony, a 37-year-old Greek Cypriot man, engaged to be married, who ran a Greek restaurant in Cambridge. Isuke Yamaki, a 29-year-old Japanese man, single, who was a photographer. Bernardo Bongo, a 29-year-old Angolan man who was celibate and a Catholic priest. Genovez selected him to heighten people's sense of guilt when they started getting lusty and violent. Possibly also, Genovez thought, it would be amazing if the priest himself became corrupted. And finally, Jose Maria Montero Perez, a 34-year-old Uruguayan man who worked as an anthropologist and had previously studied under Genovez. He was along to pad his CV. Genovez deemed Perez the most attractive man on the voyage. In addition to these 9 people, Genovez approached Captain Maria Bjornstam, a 30-year-old Swedish woman who 3 years earlier had been made the first female sea captain in the Swedish Merchant Navy. Genovez wanted a female captain, since a male captain in charge would undermine his plan to have women in positions of authority, provoking male rage. Captain Bjornstam was looking for a position on a ship at the time, and wasn't particularly thrilled at the idea of captaining a raft, which she described as, quote, a square can, a tin of sardines, with no motor. Nevertheless, Genovez was desperate, and in 1973, female captains were in short supply. He eventually persuaded Bjornstam to take part, bringing the total number of test subjects to 10 people. Again, all these individuals were told was that the study would somehow help foster world peace. The press were told the same. In accordance with his plan, all the women were given respectable positions. Maria Bjornstam was the aforementioned captain, Edna Reeves was the ship's medic, Mary Gidley was the navigator, Faye Seymour was the radio operator, and Savan Zanotti and Rashida Leave were given the busy work of conducting a pollution study on the voyage. It sounded important, but ultimately Genovez had no use for it. The 4 men, meanwhile, were tasked with stacking supplies, swabbing the decks, and other menial chores. With that, Genovez thought, the trap was set. All he would have to do was wait for all hell to break loose. Slaves in body and soul. The Acali's journey would take over 3 months, depending on the wind. The raft itself was 12 meters by 7 meters, built with plywood, iron beams, and rivets. There was a steel railing around the side to prevent people from falling overboard, and one part of the railing jutted out above the water, with a hole in the deck underneath, that people could use as a toilet, urinating and defecating in the ocean, in full view of the others. In the center of the raft was a small cabin, which contained the radio and the crew's sleeping quarters. They all slept on camp beds on the floor, squeezed closely together. In general, there were very few opportunities for privacy. On top of the cabin, which could be reached by a ladder, there was an inwardly curved roof where people could sit, relax, and talk. 2 people had to man the observation posts at all times, 24 hours a day, making sure the raft stayed on course and looking out for any potential dangers, like storms or large passing ships. No books or any other form of entertainment was permitted on board. The only concession Genovez made was allowing his former student, Jose, to bring his guitar for the occasional sing-song. Otherwise, people had no choice but to talk to each other to while away the hours. The raft came equipped with a stove and a barbecue, and plenty of food rations and, because it was 1973, many cartons of cigarettes. There were also fishing rods and nets to catch additional sources of food. Santiago Genovez named the raft Acali, which in the ancient Aztec language means house upon the water. On May 12, 1973, the Acali departed the Canary Islands off the northwest coast of Africa to considerable press attention. Even the United Nations sent the crew a message wishing them good luck on their mission for world peace. Because the raft had no motor, it had to be pulled out to the ocean current by a tugboat. Piloting the tugboat was Captain Maria Bjornstam's boyfriend at the time. As the Acali was pulled out to sea, the boyfriend's voice crackled over the radio. He wanted to speak to Maria. He had just read the contract Genovez had made the test subjects sign for the experiment, which at one point said, quote, "You are to give your body, mind, and soul to Santiago Genovez, and obey his directions in all things." Maria's boyfriend rightly thought this sounded sketchy as hell, and demanded that Maria abandon the voyage. Captain Bjornstam, however, replied that she had not signed any such contract, which was true, although the other test subjects had. Her boyfriend responded by saying that she had to choose between the voyage or him. An indignant Bjornstam shot back that she'd agreed to the assignment, and her first responsibility was to everyone aboard. And so they broke up over the radio. It was not exactly an auspicious start. The Acali and the tugboat reached the ocean current a few hours later, as night was just beginning to fall. As the rope to the tugboat was being thrown into the water, Santiago Genovez likened it to cutting an umbilical cord. The Acali Experiment had begun. How often do you masturbate? By the next morning, several of the test subjects were seasick. The small raft was thrown about quite a bit by the Atlantic's enormous waves. They stayed in their quarters and were attended to by Edna Reeves, the Israeli doctor. Eventually, the crew found their sea legs and recovered, most after a day or two, though Faye Seymour, the African-American radio operator, was nauseated for 3 whole weeks. Seasickness aside, at the start of the journey, everyone got on extremely well. Footage reveals smiling faces, laughter, a bit of childish roughhousing, and the test subjects themselves compared it to a summer vacation. Faye Seymour, the African-American radio operator, later said, quote, "The potential for violence was very minimal. The only sticking point initially was the act of shitting and pissing over the side. Initially, some of the test subjects experienced constipation, being unable to go in front of others. But as the days dragged on, and the men and women saw each other in all positions and in various stages of undress, people ceased to care. The doctor, Edna Reeves, even adopted the raft's toilet as a thinking spot, sitting on it fully clothed and facing out to sea, watching the horizon. Santiago Genovez, meanwhile, stayed aloof from the rest of the crew, scribbling detailed notes. He even attempted to mathematically quantify unquantifiable things like sexual tension and depression and aggression on a line graph for every test subject. He would then compare the numbers to the time of day, the state of the weather, and even the cycles of the moon, stemming from an old-fashioned idea from the mid-20th century that human psychosis was somehow connected to various moon phases, as if we were all werewolves. Genovez also kept track of the women's menstrual cycles to see if it affected how attractive they were to the men, and how the cycles affected the women's propensity for conflict. Again, there were no interpersonal conflicts aboard the Acali in the first few days, and everyone got along really well. As for men being more attracted to women at certain points during their menstrual cycles, Genovez again confused humans and chimpanzees. Female chimpanzees experience swelling in their genitalia, making it obvious that they're ovulating, rendering males more attracted to them. Human women, on the other hand, have concealed ovulation and no such swelling. This evolved to get humans to have more frequent sex to aid with pair bonding of a monogamous couple, so they'd stick together to raise a child, rather than clustering sexual activity into one part of the calendar. But again, as far as Genovez was concerned, it was as if the last 6 to 8 million years of evolution never happened. Every 2 days, the Acali received a weather report over the radio. Every 4 days, Genovez had to fill out detailed questionnaires asking things like, Who annoys you most? Who do you like? Who would you like to have sex with? Who would you get rid of if you could? Do you think that some people on the Acali are violent? Who? How often do you masturbate per month? Have you masturbated while aboard the Acali? Most of the test subjects answered these questions fairly honestly. Edna Reeves, the Israeli doctor, was the most expansive in her answers, hoping genuinely that the experiment would be a success. The American waitress and navigator, 36-year-old Mary Gidley, also tried to be as helpful as possible. She had developed a crush on Santiago Genovez, who was 49 at the time, the oldest man aboard, and had a certain masculine swagger and authority about him. Gidley later said that Genovez reminded her of her abusive husband, who had regularly settled arguments with punches to the face and once nearly strangled her to death. Gidley had recently applied for divorce. As for Genovez's question about masturbating aboard the Acali, it would have been very difficult to do so without being spotted. As Faye Seymour later said, quote, "It would be like masturbating in the park." Genovez also asked the test subjects whether they had any sexual contact with the others. They all initially answered no. The crew were attractive people and friendly with each other, but that did not automatically lend itself to sex. And 2 of the women were married and fully intended to stay faithful to their husbands back home. Later in the journey, Edna Reeves, who was single, wound up having sex on multiple occasions with Greek restaurant owner Charles Anthony, who had a fiancée, and Japanese photographer Eisuke Yamaki, who was single. Years later, they stated that the sex was mostly out of boredom, rather than affection or overpowering carnal lust. In order to maintain some privacy, Edna and either Charles or Eisuke would arrange to be on watch that night at the back of the raft. Then Edna would have one of the other women stand guard while she had sex with her intended partner. But by the time these sexual liaisons occurred, the crew's attitudes had soured towards Santiago Genovez, and Edna decided not to tell him. As far as Genovez knew, nobody seemed to be having sex the entire journey. And the 2 candidates he marked out as the most attractive to the others, Rashida Leave and Jose Maria Montero Perez, did not engage in sexual activity with anyone while aboard the Acali, at all. The lack of sex flatly contradicted Genovez's predictions and frustrated him to no end. Every week, Genovez got the test subjects to draw a tree for him as part of a graphological test. He had read some bullshit studies that claimed if people drew trees with strong trunks and bushy foliage, this indicated that people were at harmony. But if people drew trees with many gnarled branches going in different directions, this indicated aggression, apparently. The theory did not leave room for the possibility that some people might just like drawing trees with a lot of branches. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And when many of the test subjects dared to draw branches, Genovez got excited and concluded, quote, "From the results, I can tell that violence is present deep down in their subconscious." Captain Maria Bjornstam drew quite a few branches on her trees and refused to answer the more intrusive questions on the psychological surveys. After the first 2 weeks, she refused to fill the questionnaires out at all and refused to do any more doodles, saying that she was there to pilot the vessel, not to partake in some experiment. This caused tension between her and Genovez, which would only grow. Bjornstam thought his entire experiment was ludicrous twaddle. Once, at dinner, she asked Genovez what he hoped to get from the ocean voyage. Genovez pompously blustered, "I want to find a way to create peace in the world." Captain Bjornstam merely rolled her eyes and looked away. A frenzied mob. 3 weeks passed, and there was no sign of sex, jealousy, or aggression. The prevailing sense on the Acali was one of boredom. They were now in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There were no longer any birds in sight, and a school of sharks was frequently spotted trailing them, prompting Faye Seymour to be fairly anxious about being bitten on the bum while using the toilet. The boredom provoked even more conversations, increasingly deep and introspective, strengthening the bonds amongst the crew. Far from getting violent, they had come to embody the peaceful, kumbaya hippie philosophy that had attracted most of them there in the first place. The exception to this was Santiago Genovez, who did not bond with anyone and remained aloof. This is the correct position for a scientist to take in most experiments, but in this case, excluding himself from social bonding also served to undermine his authority. People very quickly began to view him as the other. Furthermore, Genovez was fairly unlikable at the best of times, frequently coming off as egotistical and pretentious. The American navigator, Mary Gidley, swiftly lost her infatuation with him. Even the stern and somewhat prickly Captain Bjornstam, who wielded authority stemming from her 3 years as a captain, took the time to bond with the others. This is actually one thing that chimpanzee groups do have in common with humans, and Genovez missed it. In either species, you will not maintain your authority in a social hierarchy for long if you do not form bonds and crucial alliances. It's why the dominant male in chimps is usually not the biggest bruiser per se. He's most commonly a politician who aligns himself carefully with the others. At the 4-week mark, Captain Bjornstam warned Genovez that they were not moving fast enough. The winds were too slow, and they had probably started too late in the year. Bjornstam told him they would enter the Caribbean during hurricane season, and, quote, it was suicide. Genovez dismissed the captain's concerns. He wrote in his notes, "She thinks only of safety, and nothing of science." One day, while the crew was fishing, they caught a small shark on the line and hauled it onto the raft. Everyone gathered round to look at it in mild curiosity. There certainly wasn't much else to do. Faye Seymour suggested they throw it back. However, due to the fact that none of them had tried shark before, they decided to cook and eat it. Jose Perez got the fire axe and killed it. Then the crew barbecued the shark and had an impromptu lunch. But, in his notes, Santiago Genovez records the incident rather differently. He describes it as, quote, a clear example of crowd frenzy. And he claims that Jose plunged his hand into the shark and ripped out its heart, marveling at how it was still beating. Then, according to Genovez, the rest of the crew started tearing out the shark's viscera, wanting to play with its guts in their hands. He noted his surprise that the first violence didn't happen as a result of competition or sexual desire, but animal cruelty. He regarded this incident as a breaking point in the experiment. He expected more violence to swiftly follow. He referred to the test subjects in his notes as, quote, a dangerous collective and a mob. The test subjects later denied ripping out the shark's guts or acting in a frenzied fashion. They had behaved just like any human tribe would have done after capturing an animal. They killed it, cooked it, and ate it, like our species has done for 300,000 years or more. Nevertheless, absolutely brimming with paranoia and eager anticipation, that night, Santiago Genovez claims in his notes that he hid the fire axe, just in case. Over the next several days, the crew were back to their regular smiling selves. No violence erupted. Again, Genovez grew frustrated and angry. As far as he was concerned, these people were ruining his experiment. How to lose friends and alienate people. In the 5th week of the voyage, a combination of boredom and the constant view of endless ocean began to erode people's mental health. Genovez referred to this in his notes as ocean vertigo. The psychological effects were slight, however, and did not manifest in violence. Rather, people started to speak more unguardedly and amuse themselves with funny voices and a bit of gibberish. However, one case appears to be more severe. Faye Seymour began to have visions and hear voices, though she never reported this to Genovese. Decades later, Seymour revealed that she had literally begun to hear the souls of African slaves from the 17th and 18th centuries who had crossed to the Americas in chains. They spoke to her. She was overcome with emotion and continues to insist that these voices were real to this very day. It was definitely odd, superstitious perhaps, but it was certainly not a prelude to mass violence. In the 6th week, the rudder of the vessel was damaged and needed to be repaired. The problem was the undamaged part was on the underside of the raft. Sirvan Zanotti, a professional scuba diver who had brought her equipment for the bogus pollution study, volunteered to dive underneath the raft and effect the repair. She had done this sort of thing many times before. But this time, Santiago Genovese overruled her and said, quote, "I cannot possibly risk a woman." This somewhat contradicted the purpose of the experiment, to put women in important positions in order to provoke the male test subjects to undermine them. It turned out that the only man who wound up doing so was the experiment's architect. Genovese insisted that he dive under the raft and make the repair in Zanotti's place. Genovese strapped on her gear, which didn't fit him, and leapt into the water. But his beard prevented the mask from sitting firmly on his face, and it immediately flooded with water. And so, Genovese decided he'd just hold his breath and dive under the raft. As a result, he nearly drowned. After 45 minutes of trying, Genovese came out of the water, thoroughly exhausted, and declared he'd try again tomorrow. But early the next morning, while everyone was asleep, Sirvan Zanotti strapped on her gear and dove into the water, effecting the repair within a matter of minutes and describing it as, quote, "a really small job." At 9 a.m., after breakfast, Genovese got up and announced that he would try to dive again. Zanotti gently told him that she'd already done the job earlier that morning. Genovese flew into a full-blown rage and told Zanotti that she had undermined his authority, and he accused her of mutiny, despite the fact that Genovese was an observer and not a captain. The event soured everyone's opinion of him still further. In the 7th week, the Acali was halfway across the Atlantic. There had been no quote-unquote frenzy or violence since the shark incident 3 weeks earlier. Genovese began to get frustrated and worried that nothing would happen and his experiment would be a failure. He directed his anger at the test subjects, writing, "Instead of supporting me, they behave like a bunch of children." On day 51 of the voyage, Santiago Genovese called a meeting. He announced, "We are getting too comfortable with each other. We are now going to play a game that I like to call the game of truth." And with that, Genovese started reading the answers from the extremely probing questionnaires he'd gotten everyone to fill out day after day, week upon week. Genovese read out an answer where Dr. Edna Reeves had said that the person she would most like to have sex with on the raft was the Uruguayan anthropologist, Jose Maria Montero Perez. Her humiliation was deepened when Genovese read out Jose's questionnaire, in which he said that Edna was the most irritating woman he'd ever met, and that she talked too much. Jose immediately apologized to Edna, and explained that was before he'd gotten to know her, and now he found her quite likable. Edna did not hold what were supposed to be a man's private opinions against him, and they quickly reconciled. When Genovese saw that his tactic wasn't stoking tensions, he gave up with his game of truth. He'd only succeeded in focusing more of the group's antagonism toward himself. Nevertheless, Genovese embarked on a campaign to make the test subjects miserable in order to gain some sort of material for the experiment. He began verbally abusing people and randomly splashing people in the face with buckets of water. Captain Bjornstam referred to these actions as his Gestapo methods. For her part, she began to hate the man and openly showed her contempt whenever they spoke. Meanwhile, Genovese harassed Faye Seymour, an African American, and called her a primitive, a savage, lazy, and a thief. He suggested to her, a married woman, that she have sex with Bernardo Bongo, an Angolan Catholic priest, just because they were both black. He suggested something similar to Servan Zanotti and Charles Anthony, since they were of both Mediterranean ethnicity. As the voyage continued, an increasing number of test subjects began to answer the survey question, "Who do you dislike most aboard the Acali?" with the answer, Santiago Genovese, or simply, you. The storm. On day 84, the raft finally entered the Caribbean Sea. It became warmer. The birds returned. And over the radio, Genovese began getting reports that the international press had begun running the story of the Acali expedition from a very particular angle. Genovese had given the newspapers very little detail regarding the experiment and what it was actually about. So journalists took note of the 5 male, 6 female crew on the raft and began putting 2 and 2 together on their own. Newspapers began to refer to the Acali as the sex raft and began claiming that the entire experiment was little more than an excuse to have a 3-month orgy at sea. So scandalous were the headlines and the rumors that the National Autonomous University of Mexico denounced Genovese, and his colleagues distanced themselves from him publicly. Genovese became incredibly depressed. He was a laughingstock, and worse, it looked like he'd have nothing to show for the entire experiment anyway. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Brenda was raging through the Caribbean, and it looked like the storm would turn into a full-on hurricane. When the crew heard these reports over the radio, they became scared. Captain Bjornstam insisted that they direct their sails toward the nearest Caribbean island and pause the expedition until the storm had passed. But Genovese said that any contact with civilization would, quote, contaminate the experiment. Captain Bjornstam replied that she didn't give a damn about the experiment. Her first priority was the safety of the crew. It was then that Santiago Genovese relieved the captain of command. Despite having 0 training and very little maritime experience, Genovese announced that he was the captain now. The crew's fate was now in the hands of a quack from a Mexican anthropology department. A few days passed, and the rain got more intense. As the storm approached, Genovese ordered the crew to take down the sails, batten down the supplies, and to wrap his notes in plastic. When the storm hit, Genovese told everyone to get inside the cabin so nobody could be blown overboard, and they would all ride out the storm. It was even odds whether or not their tiny craft would even survive. Maria Bjornstam sat on her camp bed in silence. She was inwardly furious. She took what had happened very seriously. Genovese had technically committed mutiny, for which, in maritime tradition, the penalty was death. And now he'd placed everybody's lives at risk. The man was a dangerous fool. After a few hours, the rain began to subside. Very fortunately, the raft had only skirted past the tail of the storm. Although Bjornstam was relieved to be alive, she spent several days in bed, not eating, and not talking to anyone. She felt humiliated, powerless. She occasionally wept out of anger and frustration. Genovese wrote in his notes that her tears were a sign of weakness. That night, 7 of the crew met on the roof of the cabin, while Genovese slept. They plotted to murder him so they could sail the raft out of the hurricane-infested Caribbean to safety at the nearest port. Isuke Yamaki proposed pushing Genovese overboard. Faye Seymour advocated drugging Genovese, and each crew member stabbing him with a knife before tossing his body into the ocean. so that everybody would be implicated in the murder and less likely to snitch. In the cabin down below, Santiago Genovez woke up and was struck with the thought. Quote, I realized that the only one to show any kind of aggression or violence on board the raft was me. Genovez says he burst into tears, crying for the first time since he was a child. Little did he know that just above him, the test subjects wanted him dead. Perhaps part of him would be thrilled. If the test subjects went through with it and murdered him, his little experiment would be a success. Captain Bjornstam to the rescue. A few days later, still early in the morning, Bernardo Bongo saw that a huge freighter, weighing approximately 15,000 tons and looming 35 meters or 115 feet above the waterline, was headed right toward them. Faye Seymour radioed the freighter, but got no response. If the ship plowed into them, the raft would be completely destroyed. Santiago Genovez, still acting as the ship's captain, fell into total hysteria. He ran fruitlessly up and down the deck, waving his arms and shouting, hoping that somehow one of the sailors would see him. Maria Bjornstam, meanwhile, kept her head. She ordered Mary Gidley to stand on top of the cabin roof, ignite some emergency flares, and wave them at the freighter with both hands. Meanwhile, Bjornstam took the helm and did her best to steer the raft away from a collision. Thankfully, the freighter's crew saw the flares, halted the engines, and then changed course. Even then, it was still an extremely close call. Having just saved everybody's lives, while Santiago Genovez had done nothing but panic, it reinforced Maria Bjornstam's position as the real captain of the Acali. Genovez fell into a depression and spent most of his time in bed, and didn't bother giving people questionnaires anymore. He'd given up. A few days later, Genovez fell ill. Several of the crew suspected he was faking it as part of another one of his mind games, but Edna Reeves later confirmed that Genovez did indeed have an infection of some kind. When Genovez recovered, he still did not resume questionnaires or his note-taking. He ceased to interact with anyone. Meanwhile, the bond between the rest of the crew had become nigh unshakable. Far from descending into anarchy, the group of 10 people had become a proper tribe. As he sulked in bed, Genovez planned another raft experiment, even going so far as to draft some blueprints for the vessel. It would be small enough to contain one person, him, and the bottom of the raft would be made of glass. That way, Genovez could stare down into the depths of the ocean as he crossed the Atlantic. Of course, this had little or no experimental value. Genovez was simply being melodramatic. On August 20th, 1973, the Acali arrived in Cozumel, Mexico. Before disembarking, Genovez held a meeting. He polled the crew. 8 of them thought the experiment had been a success, saying that they felt more tolerant somehow. 3 of the test subjects felt that the experiment was a failure. It is perhaps not surprising that Captain Bjornstam fell into the latter group. Genovez remarked that the 8-to-3 ratio was, quote, a nice little conclusion. Genovez then admitted that he had been the only person aboard to succumb to aggression. He gave a non-apology to Captain Bjornstam for the mutiny, saying he regretted her distress, but felt that he had acted correctly. He denied being abusive to the crew, but said he was sorry if anyone felt that way. And, with that, Genovez declared an end to their final meeting. In the aftermath of the Acali expedition, Genovez spun it as a success. He claimed that, due to his own lapses in judgment, that his hypothesis had been correct. He also concocted a bunch of waffle about how the experiment had been spiritually enriching, recommending to anyone in the world that if they wanted to become more enlightened like he was, they should just build a raft of their own and sail it across the Atlantic. Ultimately, however, Genovese remained an international laughingstock, especially when the test subjects spoke about their experiences to the newspapers. Nevertheless, Genovese salvaged what he could of his career and published a research article on the experiment, eventually inflating it into a book. Genovese began to make the claim that his experiment proved that humans had not gotten their violent tendencies from evolution, but rather violence was entirely the product of culture, of civilization, the exact opposite of what he had set out to prove initially. He began to say that human violence was all nurture, not nature. This is also bullshit, of course, since violence has both cultural and biological roots. Genovese continued his research career, but never attained such wide publicity ever again. He just wasn't good enough a scholar. He occasionally reached out to a newspaper to make some saccharine and rather naive-sounding call for world peace. But that was it. He died of old age in 2013. Dr. Edna Reeves returned to Israel with vaguely positive feelings about the Acali, but she quickly forgot all the supposed lessons about world peace at the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War a few months later, in October 1973. The environmentalist, Rashida Tlaib, went back to work in Paris as if the entire trip had never happened. Captain Maria Bjornstam returned to Sweden, hoping that the bad press from the Acali had not permanently damaged her naval career. She soon found work as the second mate on a ship. And Faye Seymour returned to the United States, thinking that the experiment had been a huge success, but that Santiago Genovese had missed it. He had wanted violence, but he was confronted with peace. And when Genovese had become a threat to that peace, the tribe had rebelled against his authority. And if the Acali was a microcosm of the world, perhaps the wider population of average, everyday people would eventually do the same to tyrants everywhere. According to Faye Seymour, that was the one thing that came out of the madness of the Acali experiment that gave her hope and renewed faith in mankind. Thank you for watching.